Good morning. Good morning. If everybody can grab a seat. Thank you all for logging on. We're going to get started. I want to thank everyone for being here today, both in person and online. This is our most successful solutions conference ever, both in terms of in person and a record number online as well. Over 400 registered to be online and 250 to be with us today. So thank you all so much for being here. I am thrilled to welcome you to Solutions for Affordable Housing 2023. This event would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, TD Bank, Rocket Mortgage. Our networking reception tonight will be sponsored by Living Cities as well as our Wi-Fi. And our panel sponsors are the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, Freddie Mac, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of Realtors, NeighborWorks America, Pretium, and Zillow, and our supporting sponsor, Habitat for Humanity. I am proud to stand here before such a diverse and passionate group of affordable housing leaders from across the country. For those deeply engaged in the work of affordable housing, this event is not just an opportunity, it's a necessity. The urgency to place housing at the forefront of our national political dialogue has never been more crucial, given the persistent affordability crisis affecting communities nationwide. And I'll give you an example. We have a paycheck-to-paycheck database on our website, nhc.org. There's a link for it right on the cover of the website. And that database tracks 150 occupations and affordability for all kinds of different levels of rental and home ownership in 390 metropolitan areas. And one of the things that we can see there is that in 90 of these areas, a registered nurse cannot afford to buy their own home. And a teacher cannot afford to buy their own home in 122 of those metro areas. And this is really a historic level of unaffordability that is no longer just about large bicoastal cities, but is happening all over the country. Soaring housing costs contribute to inflation, leaving families nationwide grappling to make ends meet, and unfortunately, in too many instances, struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Today's conference is designed with a laser focus on actions that are not only tangible, but also impactful and achievable. These sessions are tailored to provide participants with valuable insights, enhancing their understanding of how their organization's objectives align with a broader national housing strategy. I'm honored that we have two distinguished keynote speakers who have spearheaded significant advances in housing policy joining us today. Sandra Thompson, the Director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and Dr. Lael Brainard, the White House National Economic Advisor. Dr. Brainard will join us shortly to discuss the Biden administration's efforts to enhance affordable housing for all Americans, including the Housing Supply Action Plan and initiatives focused on affordable rental and racial equity. And later, NHC's board chair, Steve O'Connor, will join Director Thompson for a fireside chat where they will talk about FHFA's initiatives to broaden affordable home ownership and rental opportunities, including recent actions around loan level price adjustments, capital, credit scoring, the federal home loan banks, and opportunities to address the housing supply shortage. And I just want to say a quick word about Lael Brainard and Sandra Thompson. Recently, the Federal Reserve Board, the OCC, and the FDIC produced their final rule on CRA modernization, the first major modernization of CRA since 1995, when interstate banking was really in its infancy, barely existed, and nobody was using mobile banking or online banking at all. And I think it's such a significant achievement, and we really have to recognize that the leader of this initiative, and she would never say this herself, but it's true, so you're just going to have to sit there and take it. This would not have happened but for the leadership of Lael Brainard as a Federal Reserve Vice Chair and Governor, and thank you so much for everything you did with that. It was not easy. It took much longer than anybody wanted to, and I think one of the main driving factors for the final negotiations between all the regulators was, please don't make us do this again. But thank you so much. It's really an impressive accomplishment, and it has received very broad support and acknowledgement. And there's a lot of work yet to do. The FAQs are such an important part of the implementation of a new regulation, and so there is absolutely a place for you to get your questions answered, and please don't be shy about letting us know and about letting the regulators know. Sandra Thompson, we're going to see her later. I just have to say she is an inspiration to me. This is somebody who was appointed by the president, who was acting in a position, and then appointed by the president. And in that period, before she was confirmed, achieved more than most people achieve in their entire time in the office. She was fearless and relentless and fair, and it's exactly what we expect from our appointed and elected officials. And I won't say how often we get that otherwise. I don't want to be negative. We also have senior staffers from the National Economic Council, Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, and the House Financial Services Committee, who will share invaluable insights on navigating legislative and regulatory landscape in 2024 and beyond. And so I don't want to take up any more time, and we're thrilled to have Dr. Brainard. Steve O'Connor is going to introduce her, and then we're going to get right into it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, David. Good morning. So before I bring our next speaker to stage, I just want to give a quick overview of how the Q&A is going to work. If you have a question for Dr. Brainard, or index cards and pens on the tables, please write your question on the index card. NHC staff will go around, they'll collect them. I'll be off stage after Dr. Brainard speaks, and I will ask a couple questions. She does have a hard stop at 9:25, so we're only going to have time for a couple of questions. With that having been said, I am honored to introduce Dr. Lael Brainard, the 14th Director of the National Economic Council. In this role, she coordinates policy making for domestic and international economic issues, gives economic policy advice to the President, ensures policy decisions and programs are consistent with the President's economic goals, and monitors implementation of the President's economic policy agenda. Prior to this role, she served as Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, Under Secretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. She was also Vice President at the Brookings Institution. She received her master's and PhD in economics from Harvard and was an associate professor of economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. The Washington Post called her a force in Washington for over 2 decades, noting that at the time she had amassed, this is a quote, amassed an unusually large portfolio, including where she was the only Democrat on the Fed board through much of the Trump administration, end quote. She, as David mentioned, she was key to the Fed's emergency response to the pandemic and led the Fed's effort to modernize the Community Reinvestment Act, which resulted in a final rule last month. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lael Brainard.
Well, thank you very much, both to Steve and to David for an incredibly kind introduction. It's really nice to be here at the National Housing Conference, and of course, speaking to one of the most important issues on the President's economic agenda, lowering costs and increasing access to housing for Americans. President Biden is very focused on the fact that too many Americans see the path to the middle class as being out of reach, and so lowering costs is vital to make that within reach for all American families. So he's fighting from everything to lower costs, from everything to prescription drugs to a gallon of gas, but of course, the most important monthly expense for most American households is housing. Housing that is affordable also, as this group really knows, provides a foundation for everything else that is vital to ensuring a path to the middle class, whether it's securing a good job, engaging in training and education, providing for our children, and building a financial cushion for the future. So our agenda has been guided by the goal of lowering housing costs. During the pandemic, that meant ensuring Americans could afford simply to remain in their housing despite the disruption to incomes. Since the recovery, our agenda has focused on increasing the availability of housing that Americans can afford, lowering costs for home buyers, and lowering costs and promoting fairness for renters. So I'm going to touch briefly on each of these. Of course, during the pandemic, businesses were laying off tens of millions of workers, and millions of Americans could have faced the possibility of eviction or foreclosure. President Biden came to office very focused on making sure that would not happen, and working with many of you in this room, together with state and local governments, the administration delivered more than 10 million emergency rental or utility assistance payments, provided financial assistance to nearly 400,000 homeowners at risk of foreclosure, and worked to provide unified and consistent mortgage modification options for millions of borrowers. And as a result, we came through this pandemic in much better shape, with foreclosures and evictions below or at pre-pandemic levels. And the Black homeownership has actually increased above pre-pandemic levels, although the gap remains very large. While job opportunities today are much brighter and many things have gotten more affordable, we know that affording a quality place to live is still a challenge for so many Americans. We know there was already a shortfall in affordable housing construction and preservation going into the pandemic, and that currently the average renter pays 30% of their income on rent every month, and around half of renter households are considered rent burden. So our first major priority has to be to increase the supply of affordably priced housing. We're using every lever at our disposal: legislative initiatives, administrative authorities, convening power, and of course the bully pulpit. The greatest improvement in supply will come from having Congress act. The President's budget proposed housing tax credits that increase the number of households that would have access to affordable rents by 1.2 million over the next decade. That means rents at about 24% of area median income. And those provisions are also in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, and we need to continue to encourage Congress to act. On top of this, the Neighborhoods Investment Act proposal would promote homeownership for an additional 500,000 households while increasing neighborhood revitalization investments. 225 bipartisan members of Congress have sponsored these bills. We should get them done. But we can't wait for Congress to act. Through the Housing Supply Action Plan, we're reducing barriers to housing. We're promoting local zoning reforms that will mean more quality, affordable housing near good jobs and transportation hubs. Communities across the country, from Minneapolis and Massachusetts to our neighbors near here in Alexandria and Arlington, are enacting zoning reforms that encourage denser housing, making certain funds contingent on building more affordable housing, and particularly near public transportation. These programs work. So we're standing up the first of its kind pro-housing grant program to support communities in identifying and removing those barriers to housing production. We've already embedded incentives to reduce barriers to affordable housing into about $10 billion in transportation funding, and the Department of Transportation is making billions of dollars in low-cost loans available for developing housing near transit. Given the shift to greater teleworking and high office vacancy rates in some downtowns, we're also supporting the commercial to rental conversion market as a win-win solution to promote affordable housing and downtown revitalization. We recently announced a series of actions to encourage those conversions and hope that we can expand on those proposals in the months ahead. We'll be examining other forms of federal financing also to ensure they're being maximally utilized to increase the supply of affordable housing, from HUD's home program to the Federal Home Loan Bank affordable housing programs. As was mentioned, the banking agency's first rewrite of the Community Reinvestment Act rule in 25 years will work together with those initiatives to provide a critical boost to the supply of affordable housing. It will increase investment in communities that are currently underserved, specifically low and moderate income communities and communities of color. The new rule will encourage increased investments according to independent analysis, and encourage banks to make more LIHTC equity investments possible in underserved rural areas and small cities. And the new evaluation framework increased transparency about qualifying investments, and inclusion of special purpose credit programs will help address persistent racial home ownership and wealth gaps and bring much needed capital, including mortgage credit, to credit deserts. The second major priority is to lower costs for home buyers and promote access to home ownership, particularly for communities that have faced persistent barriers. The recent increase in interest rates has intensified the challenges to that goal. President Biden is very committed to doing more to support families who want to become homeowners but face affordability challenges. And he also is keenly aware that for some communities, those barriers are longstanding. We've acted to lower housing costs for first-time home buyers who disproportionately rely on the Federal Housing Administration program. Earlier this year, FHA lowered their mortgage interest premiums by 0.3 percentage points. That means savings of around $1,200 per year for a home buyer buying a median-priced home. But there's so much more we could do across the federal government, state and local governments, and industry to lower costs. A number of key home buying costs allow for little consumer choice, but can really add up and be a daunting impediment to that initial purchase. That's why federal agencies are currently examining whether there are other actions that can be taken to lower costs, promote greater competition, and encourage home ownership. The President's budget also includes a first-generation down payment assistance program to help make homeownership a reality for families who do not have the advantage of previous generational wealth building from homeownership. Passing this legislation is vital to begin to close this stubborn racial homeownership gap. Addressing this gap, in addition to other instances of housing discrimination, is central to all of our housing efforts. HUD is currently working to finalize an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that reflects the principle that communities that receive federal housing aid must take meaningful affirmative steps to overcome patterns of exclusion. And then finally, I'll just touch on what we're doing to promote fairness in the rental market and access to affordable rents for the lowest income Americans. We've secured rental assistance for an additional 100,000 low-income households, guaranteeing rents at 30% of those families' incomes. And the President budget proposes to expand rental assistance to an additional 200,000 households, including a first-of-its-kind rental assistance program for low-income veterans and former foster youth. Through the Blueprint for a Renter's Bill of Rights, we've acted to ensure renters can address inaccuracies in tenant screening reports and enhance eviction prevention. And we're also going after rental junk fees, from repeated rental application fees to surprise convenience fees, which raise rental costs for millions of families and prevent apples-to-apples comparison shopping. And we're working to ensure renter protections evolve with changing market dynamics. For example, Justice has identified algorithmic price fixing as the new frontier and explained that given the amount of information an algorithm can access and digest, this new frontier poses an even greater anti-competitive threat. In closing, we know we have to do more at all levels of government, and our partnership with all of you in this room is vital to lower housing costs and ensuring all Americans have access to affordable and quality housing. So with that, why don't I wrap up and take a few questions?
So, Dr. Brainard, you touched on inflation, higher costs. So the question is, how does inflation play into your policymaking now? Is this the new normal, and are we making the progress that we need?
Yeah, so Broadly speaking, we are making tremendous progress. Inflation is on its way back down. 65% reduction in inflation, and I think the path towards pre-pandemic levels of inflation is now clearly lies ahead. And we've done that in the context of a strong employment market, which nobody in the kind of traditional economics community thought was possible. So from that perspective, the labor market is quite bright. Incomes have more than compensated for that period of inflation, and inflation is coming down. But that doesn't mean we don't think that so many households believe they are facing a real affordability challenge, and that's why we're fighting every day. Healthcare costs, for instance, are a huge challenge for many households, and so the president has a number of really important legislative wins that have brought prescription drug prices down for many households. Housing is another area that we know is unaffordable or seems very daunting to many households, and that's why we have the full set of initiatives that we've been discussing here today. We need to work on every front to make housing more affordable and more accessible to families all across the country, because that is the single biggest monthly expense. It's the monthly expense that if we bring that down, that'll give families a little more breathing room at the end of every month.
Great, thank you. So what is the administration doing to promote homeownership sustainability, especially given rapidly rising home insurance costs?
Yeah, so we are working very hard to understand some of the drivers of the increases in insurance costs in some areas. A lot of the authorities in that area are at the state level, but we are using the ability to gather data and to convene to try to understand why some states are seeing large increases in insurance costs and others are not. And we're going to use the convening power, the data gathering power, to really push on why some of those costs are going up. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking for renters at areas that we have identified as junk fees. Why is it that you should have to pay a fee for the convenience of paying online your rent every month? That is a convenience that is just a natural method of payment that most rentals should provide free. Why is it that people should pay large fees to apply to multiple rentals, even though they will only be able to secure one of them? So we're really looking at a whole host of fees that we think perhaps greater competition would drive down.
Great, so we only have time for one more question. The biggest challenge is there's so many good ones. So the last one, Dr. Brainard, is how is your organization taking climate, both risk and mitigation investment, into account?
Yeah, so we have tremendous focus on climate mitigation and investments in resilience and very substantial funding that is targeted at those communities that have traditionally been most exposed to environmental risks and least able to afford mitigation and resilience investments. So those programs which were secured as part of the President's Investing in America legislative achievements, we now have a very active set of implementation that is underway. And again, it's very much directed at those communities who have traditionally been the most exposed and the least able to invest in resilience. We also understand that those investments will be really critical to making housing affordable by bringing those insurance costs down. So the two things are tied together.
Dr. Brainard, we do want to keep you on schedule. Thank you very much. You've been generous with your time. Please
Thank
give
you.
Dr. Brainard a 1 minute.
Thank you very much.